So the second case study that we're going to look at is the tenancy reform in West Bengal. So it's in the context of agriculture and rural land titling as opposed to the Peruvian context. And this is based on this paper by Banerjee, Turtle and Cutter that came out in Journal of Political Economy in the year 2002. And title is Empowerment and Efficiency, Tenancy Reform in West Bengal. So in this paper, the context that they're looking at is sharecroppers in agriculture who lease land from landlords who don't cultivate land on their own. So basically, landlords who don't want to cultivate the land, they give out these lands to sharecroppers on lease, and the sharecropper are the main cultivators. So they are the ones sort of who are using the land and cultivating and producing output. And the idea is that a part of a share of the revenue of the output uh, will go to the landlord, and the rest will be will be kept by the sharecropper, right? So that's the arrangement. Um, Now, this arrangement is worked out via bargaining between landlord and the sharecropper or the tenant, and so they have a contract, so to speak, wherein the sort of terms of this engagement is going to be fixed. So to what extent the landlord is going to pay any sort of input cost or anything, and what will be the share of the output that the landlord will get, and how much will the tenant keep. Okay? And how frequently they would revise their contract, etc. All these kinds of details are sort of threshed out in their bargaining, right? And so this bargaining and the contract that the landlord and the tenant sort of fixes has an important bearing on how much hard work and investment um, would the cultivator, meaning the tenant, is going to actually put in to produce the output. And for different degrees of, for different contracts, it will have different incentives for the tenant to put in higher or lower effort, right? So for example, if the share that the landlord can demand from the tenant is very high, then for every unit of effort that the tenant provides to produce the output, he only keeps a smaller share of it, and so then the marginal return on putting in effort is going to be lower, and that in turn is going to reduce the optimum amount of effort that the tenant is going to put in, right? So then if the contract specifies a very high share that the landlord can keep, then that will significantly reduce the incentive of the tenant to put in effort to produce the output. And so these kinds of, therefore, engagement and this kind of contract will have an implication on the actual production. And here the law and the institutions are important, because these laws and regulations and the actual practice of laws, this can affect what kind of contract can be written between the landlord and the tenant. And depending on the law, it can also shape the bargaining power of the landlord vis-a-vis the tenant, right? Or the other way around, it can determine the power of the tenant vis-a-vis the landlord, right? So then if the law is sort of made to favor the tenant more, then tenant's bargaining power can go up, which can sort of change the contract that tenant and landlord is going to sign, which will in turn affect tenants' effort and agricultural production and efficiency, etc. So that's where I think legal institutions such as tenancy rights are important, because it can have implications on final productive efficiency of agriculture in areas where these kind of sharecropping arrangements are quite common. So West Bengal is such a context, which is why they wanted to look at that context. So a little bit of detail about tenancy rights in India. So India had the Land Reforms Act in 1995, which basically said that the tenants should register with the state, and once you register as a tenant, then landlord could evict the tenant if he wanted to use the land for what is called personal cultivation. So otherwise, if you are a registered tenant, then you have a permanent tenancy right, and it's also inheritable, right? Um, Now, the other aspect of the Land Reforms Act was that the landlord share from a registered tenant cannot be more than 25%. In case the landlord pays all the non-labor input cost, then the landlord share can be at max 50%. But the authors mentioned that this almost never happens. Usually, it's the tenant who is paying at least part of the non-labor input cost. So if the tenant is registered, then landlord cannot claim more than 25% of the output. Okay. However, in practice, this law was sort of kind of toothless because landlord could use this loophole of personal cultivation as an excuse to always threaten the tenants whenever they wanted to register. Okay? So the point is that the landlord, you know, the tenants could potentially claim that he could keep 75% of the output, he could register himself as a tenant, but the landlord could always use this loophole of personal cultivation as a sort of threat point, saying that if you indeed end up registering, I'm going to use that clause and I'm going to evict you as a tenant, and I'm going to get someone else. So, and that kind of threat will be credible if there are a lot of sort of landless people who are ready to work as tenants, and that was the case in India, right? So the, the, the set of landowners were relatively small, and the set of potential tenants, people who are landless but was ready to cultivate land on lease, was potentially large. So this was a credible threat on the part of the landlord. Moreover, the registration process was costly and time consuming, like in the Peruvian case, sort of the pre-reform case, right? So the tenant would have to approach the relevant government office and go through a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork in order to register themselves. So that also sort of inhibited the ability of tenants to register and sort of to be able to use the power of the law to get a better deal out of this tenancy contract. And because of these two issues, this sort of loophole of personal cultivation that the landlord could use to credibly threaten to evict the tenant, and the costly registration process, these two gave landlord a lot of bargaining power. On top of that, landlords are typically from the upper caste, and they are the sort of the elite of in the villages. So that gave landlords a lot of power to extract a greater share of the output from the tenants. So this tenancy reform in West Bengal happens in that context. So the left front comes to power in West Bengal for the first time in 1977, and right after they come into power, they go about doing this specific land reform, which is the West Bengal Land Reforms Act, which basically strengthens this, so basically closes the loophole. So it puts in very strict conditions that the landlord would have to satisfy in order to use the personal cultivation clause, right? So it basically makes it very hard for landlord to use the personal cultivation clause. Secondly, the government, while passing the Land Reforms Act, also initiates this reform, administrative reform called Operation Barga. So what is sort of similar to the Peruvian case, what they do is basically they do a village to village campaign to register tenants. So basically, the state is going to the tenants to ensure that that registration takes place. And then they're going to, the officials would spend time with the tenants to explain the registration process and what kind of rights it will give them, etc. So there was a lot of hand holding during this point of time, and to ensure that a lot of tenants register. Moreover, the registration process was made easier, so sort of to facilitate better registration. And secondly, it was a disruption from the existing cultural norms where the landlord yielded a lot of power in the local village. So, in order to ensure that this actual registration process on the ground happens more smoothly, the state government mobilized local political organizations. So, basically, Gram Panchayat institutions where their sort of local politicians ensured that there is no backlash from the landlord to sort of stop this kind of registration process or to threaten the tenants from registering. Right. So these kinds of uh, uh, um, activities on the part of the state ensure that the Operation Barga was a successful campaign. So basically, by 1993, which is about say 15 years later, uh, the about two-thirds of the of 2.3 million sharecroppers was registered. Okay. So a substantial part of the sharecroppers was registered under this program. And so this was a large campaign within the state and large sort of governance drive. Now the question is, why would it change production? So I've already mentioned this. So the insecure tenancy rights in absence of this reform um, um, resulted in two kinds of inefficiencies. The first is that the threat of eviction keeps bargaining power of tenant low, so tenant's share of the output is lower. And if tenant's share of the output is lower, then for every unit of effort that the tenant wants to put in, the tenant only keeps whatever output that's generated, he only keeps a smaller share of it. So that in turn reduces the marginal incentive to put in effort, and therefore optimum effort put in by the tenant would be lower, right? And so which means that the output will be lower. So basically, suppose you are a tenant and instead of getting 75% if you could register, you are only getting 50 or less than 50% of the output. Then your incentive to produce as much or large, or to sort of your motivation to work hard to ensure high volume of output is not as high, because you know that you have to part with at least 50% of the output. Um, and second, if because the threat of eviction was always there, um, it's sort of similar to the Peruvian case. The incentive of the uh, um, tenant to invest in the land that could potentially increase the productivity of the land. These kinds of long-term investment would not happen, right? Because the tenant knows that if he could suffers from this risk that even if he invests, he could be sort of evicted the next period, because there are a lot of tenants that are out there, potential tenants that are out there that they could who could replace him. That sort of reduces that sort of reduces the incentive of the tenant to make these kinds of long-term investments on the land. Again, this has long-term consequences for agricultural productivity, especially in areas where this kind of sharecropping is prevalent, right? So now once the reform comes in, this tenure insecurity goes down, right? So in presence of tenure insecurity, basically the tenants will discount the future flow of income much more, right? So the discount rate will be much smaller, and therefore the sort of the tenants will be much less forward looking. So now investment is sort of, you have to pay upfront cost for this long term investment, and the return will come only in the future. So if you face these kinds of 10-year insecurity, you are going to discount future incomes more. So your incentive to pay this upfront cost is much lower, because you are not sure that you're going to stay long enough to reap the benefits of this investment. So Operation Borga sort of reduces this 10-year insecurity, so that makes individuals much more forward-looking, which increases the incentive. Moreover, it increases the bargaining power of the tenants, because now once you register yourself, you have the sort of legal recourse if you cannot keep more than 75% or more of your output, because then you can sort of complain against the state that the landlord is violating this rule, um, and then sort of this sort of goes in goes in the hands of the state territory for dispute resolution. So that increases the bargaining power of the tenant, which potentially could increase the share of output that he keeps for himself. So that also makes him invest in this kind of long-term productivity enhancing investments, and that can increase output. Okay. So, so both from the point of view of making the tenant more forward-looking, and giving higher incentive for long-term investment, as well as giving sort of greater incentive to put in higher effort, because the tenant get to keep a greater share of the output now that his bargaining power is improved, would lead to better production. Now, what the authors do is basically they use data on first they do a survey of a set of villages, where they look at the out the where they basically ask the tenants how much share of the output that they are keeping, and how much share they were keeping in the pre-program period, and then they're going to use district level variation in the intensity of this registration process over time. So again, this registration process didn't happen at the same time at all the districts of West Bengal. It sort of happened in a staggered way, and the program or the registration coverage went up for every district over time. So they're going to use this registration coverage of districts in West Bengal, and what they're going to do is compare that to the districts in Bangladesh. So they're going to collect output yield data. So that basically they're looking at rice production, because rice is the sort of main agricultural output in this part of the country. So they're going to look at rice production, and they're going to look at district level rice production during the pre and the post program period in West Bengal districts vis-a-vis Bangladesh districts. Bangladesh acts as a control for them, because they have a sort of similar socioeconomic characteristics and similar sort of agricultural practices, and the main output there is also rice. And but the West Bengal sort of had this West Bengal had this Operation Borga starting from 1977, and there was no such program happening in Bangladesh at that time. And so that's why we're going to use this kind of treatment control comparison of West Bengal districts being treated, Bangladesh districts being controlled, and using pre-77 and post-77 period as the sort of the pre-post. So again, they're going to use difference in difference as their main analysis, and then they're going to only sort of get rid of Bangladesh and only look at West Bengal district, and use this program intensity over time to also check whether that also gives similar results. Okay? So they're going to use two approaches. One is this difference in difference approach, using Bangladesh as a control group, and using pre and post reform period as the two periods. And then in the second approach, they're going to use only districts of West Bengal and look at registration coverage for every district over time, and then see whether that correlates positively with increasing in yields, controlling for other features of districts that could also affect yield. So this is the first result. This is basically showing that the reform resulted in increase in the tenants crop share. So basically, if you look at the post, if you look at the pre-period, all virtually all tenants were keeping 50% of the share. So about 80% of the tenants are keeping 50% of the share, and that comes down to about 60% in the post-reform period. So, and the largest increase is basically 75 to 200% range. So this range. So there's more a greater proportion of tenants who keep at least 75% of the share. That goes up in the post-reform period, right? So that's sort of showing that the bargaining power shifts in favor of the tenant thanks to the reform. This is the difference in difference model on log output. So Y is output in district D in year T, and they have, and this has both West Bengal districts and Bangladesh districts, right? So that's the sample. They have district specific fixed effect, so district specific dummies, year fixed effect, so year specific dummies, and then treatment times post, where post takes value 1 if it is above, if it is 1977 onwards, and 0 for the pre 1977 period. And treatment is our districts in West Bengal. So basically treatment is, so treatment is West Bengal district, and control is the Bangladesh districts. So it's a, district is a treatment, that means it's in West Bengal. Okay, and then you have a bunch of controls, and we're going to talk about some of these controls, and you're going to see whether whether West Bengal districts, which are the treatment districts, have a higher output in the post period relative to Bangladesh districts. This is just a time trend, sort of raw data before we show the results, and you see that they are sort of very similar, especially in the post 1977 period. You see that their trends on average are very similar. In the post 1977, it's also similar, but you see sort of West Bengal gradually taking over Bangladesh a little bit. Moreover, you see this drop in 1981 and 82, and that's because of drought. So there was drought in this period. So that resulted in this drop for West Bengal. So first they check for parallel trends. So for parallel trends, they look at the 1969 to 78 period. Their output, the dependent variable is log of rice yield per hectare. So that's the measure of productivity. And they find that West Bengal. So if you look at the coefficient of West Bengal, that's not statistically different from 0. So basically, the coefficient is very small and statistically insignificant, which basically tells you that during this during the pre-reform period, West Bengal and Bangladesh districts are very similar productivity. For the post period, they have sort of 3 time periods. So 1979 to 83, 84 to 88, and 88 to 93. So their sort of time periods end in 93. And in the first period, they find that West Bengal had a lower rice yield per hectare than Bangladesh, and in the subsequent periods, West Bengal had a higher rice yield per hectare than Bangladesh. However, this negative effect is all driven by the drought years. So if they run the regression excluding the drought years, they find that in the initial few years following the reform, basically there was no difference between rice yield per hectare of Bangladesh and West Bengal. So that this coefficient is statistically insignificant and small. But in the subsequent years, West Bengal's districts have a higher productivity. So I have a higher rice yield per hectare than sure. So basically, what they're doing is they're attributing this higher yield to higher yield per hectare in West Bengal to the reform, right? Now, during this reform, the West Bengal didn't just provide tenure security to these tenants, they also engaged in various kinds of other activities. So basically, their irrigation, they expanded the irrigation quite a lot, and they also provided high yield variety seeds as part of Green Revolution, right? So this is also the time when the Green Revolution is taking place in India overall, and so the usage of high yield variety is also going up. So in case these public irrigation and high yield variety seed usage is going up in West Bengal much more than in Bangladesh, then that could also be contributing factor to the greater productivity, right? So what they do in the next regression is basically they first control for weather, so rainfall, and then they control for how much public irrigation investment has happened in these districts, both in West Bengal as well as in Bangladesh districts, and the high yield variety share of grain cultivation area. They also control for that. Now, what is interesting is that let's look at the excluding drought year sample, because that's a sort of is a better sample because it's devoid of that dip. What you get is that again you get that in the initial period, in the initial period post reform 79 to 83, there is no differential trend there is no differential effect on West Bengal relative to Bangladesh, right, across all three specifications. However, in the second set of years, in the second period, West Bengal's West Bengal has a greater rice yield, and that effect becomes statistically significant when you control for high yield variety share of high yield variety grain in cultivation area. Similarly, so you see this 0.04 increases in magnitude becomes 0.06, and it becomes statistically significant when you control for this. And when you control for public irrigation, again this coefficient, which was already 0.07 and statistically significant for the third period, the coefficient increases to 0.11, so that's a large increase. It increases by greater than 50%, and it becomes even more statistically significant. When you control for high yield variety, it increases even more by another 0.6, so it's another 50%. So that's a large increase, and it becomes and remains statistically significant. So basically, what you have is that the moment you actually control for these public policy changes in West Bengal and in Bangladesh in irrigation and high yield variety, it actually makes the coefficient even larger for West Bengal. So it makes the program effect even stronger. Why that can happen? That can happen when these trends in public irrigation and high yield variety is actually stronger in Bangladesh. So basically, during this period in Bangladesh, the investment in public irrigation and high yield variety is happening at a faster rate than West Bengal. That's why if you do not control for it, you basically see a muted effect in the post period, or muted difference in rice yield per hectare in the post period. The moment you sort of absorb those effect of those on output, then you see in the post period the difference is even larger. So a greater. So basically, if you don't control for these differential trends in irrigation and high variety, you will find a sort of you will underestimate the effect of the reform on output. But when you control for it, you get a greater effect. So that's the idea. So if anything, these trends are much stronger in Bangladesh. So one should control for it if you don't want to underestimate. This is the final slide. This is basically using the second approach. So this is only West Bengal. There is no Bangladesh sample here. In the West Bengal sample from 1979 to 93, so this is only post-reform in West Bengal, right? So you can't do diff and diff. What you basically do, so then all districts are kind of treated districts because it's the post-reform period. But what you look at is you correlate the sharecropper registration 1 year before. So 1 year lagged, what percentage of sharecroppers are registered, you regress that on the log of rice yield, controlling for all these kinds of weather and public irrigation roads and yield variety. And what you get systematically is that in districts with as districts get higher and higher share of their sharecropper registered under Operation Barga, you get greater increase in log of rice, greater increase in rice yield. So basically that tells you that even within West Bengal, if I compare districts over time, what we find is that districts that had greater registration had stronger effects. Now, this need not be a causal effect because the districts which experienced a greater growth of registration of sharecroppers could also be the districts where maybe the left had a much better presence, so they could implement it well. And if the left had much better presence, it could have had other positive outcomes in terms of providing better market integration, better other kind of governance practices which could have benefited the farmers in achieving greater growth. So what they're doing here is that they are trying to control for it by using whether this area in 1977 was a left front controlled area and allowing districts with having left front control or not to have differential trends by interacting this dummy with year. It's also using south, whether southern districts which are closer to Calcutta, which had sort of better market access, also to have differential trends. So they are interacting the dummy for south with the year to allow this sort of the trend in production to be differential across southern and the rest of West Bengal, southern districts and West Bengal. So even allowing for differential trends across near Calcutta districts and left front control districts, even then they find strong effects. So that's why they're sort of claiming that this correlation is indeed the causal effect of sharecropper registration on output. However, they do not show any direct effect whether this sharecropper registration effect on output is operating via the fact that the sharecropper is making greater investments in the land, and the sharecroppers who are getting a better share of the output are the ones who are increasing their output. So they don't show this mechanism, but sort of that they're sort of suggesting that that's the mechanism, even though there is no direct evidence for it. So this is the two papers, both of which show that when you increase security of titles, either in the case of urban titling, residents sort of move out to better economic opportunities because their mobility becomes more relaxed, or in the case of agricultural context, the tenants become more secure of their tenancy, and so then they are more likely to get higher share of the output, which can incentivize them to produce better output, and you do find that the rice production goes up. Right? So let me stop here, and on Thursday we're going to discuss what happened in Vietnam. It's a good time.